The red lights flashed across Luna Base 7 as Jake Morrison ran down the metal hallway. His boots made loud sounds on the floor as he rushed to the communications center. Something big was happening, and every person on the moon base could feel it in the air. The emergency alarm had been going off for 10 minutes now, and Jake knew this was not a drill. Jake pushed through the heavy doors and saw Susan Blake standing in front of the giant computer screen. Her face was white and her hands were shaking as she worked on the alien message that had just arrived from deep space. Susan was the best person on Earth when it came to understanding alien languages, but Jake had never seen her look so scared before. The message was coming through in pieces, and each new part made Susan look more worried. Jake walked over to her and put his hand on her shoulder. Susan looked up at him with wide eyes and said the words that would change everything for humanity. The aliens were asking for help, and they were dying. Frank Carter was eating his morning coffee when the call came through to Earth Defense Headquarters. He was an old man who had spent his whole life in the military, and he had seen many wars, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to hear. The voice on the other end of the phone was shaking as it told him about the alien message. Frank put down his coffee cup and walked to the big war room where all the computer screens showed maps of space. His officers were already there, and they all looked worried. The alien message was playing on the main screen, and Frank could see why everyone was scared. The aliens were talking about something called the Devourers, and they had already destroyed hundreds of worlds. The message said that the Devourers had come from the edge of the galaxy, and they were eating everything in their path. Whole star systems were gone, and millions of aliens were dead. The strongest alien armies had tried to fight, but they had all failed. Now the aliens were asking any race that could hear the message to run away and save themselves. Frank looked at the star map and saw the red marks showing where the Devourers had been. They were moving fast, and they were heading toward the part of space where Earth was located. If the aliens were right, then humanity had maybe a few years before the Devourers reached human space. Helen Torres was in a meeting when her assistant ran into the room and whispered something in her ear. Helen was the president of Earth, and she had to make the hard choices that would decide if humanity lived or died. She told everyone to leave the room except for her top military people, and then she listened to the alien message. The room was quiet as the alien voices spoke about death and destruction. Helen could see that her generals wanted to start moving people away from Earth, but she was thinking about something else. She was thinking about how humans had always been fighters, and how they had never run away from a fight. Paul Hughes stood up and said they should start moving people to the far colonies right away. He said the aliens were much more advanced than humans, and if they could not win, then humans had no chance. Lisa Martinez disagreed and said that humans should at least try to help fight the Devourers. Helen listened to both sides, but she already knew what she was going to do. She had read about human history, and she knew that humans always fought back when something tried to destroy them. She stood up and told everyone that humanity would answer the alien call for help back on Luna Base. 7 Jake was helping Susan decode more of the alien message. They learned that the aliens called themselves the Galactic Council, and they had been working together for thousands of years. The Devourers were something ancient that had been sleeping at the edge of space until something woke them up. Susan found a part of the message that showed what the Devourers looked like. They were not ships or robots, but something alive and hungry. They were bigger than cities, and they could change their shape to fight better. When they ate a planet, they became stronger and could make more of themselves. Jake looked at the pictures and felt his stomach turn. The Devourers looked like giant worms made of shadow, and they had teeth the size of buildings. But Jake was not scared because he was human, and humans had been fighting monsters since the beginning of time. The final part of the alien message gave the location of the last Council stronghold. It was a system called Kepler, and the Council was making their final stand there. They said that any race that wanted to help should come quickly, because they could not hold out much longer. Susan finished decoding the message and looked at Jake. She asked him if he really thought humans could fight something that had destroyed civilizations that were thousands of years older than Earth. Jake smiled. and said that humans had something the aliens did not understand, and that was the human refusal to give up when things looked hopeless. Within hours, the message was sent to every human world and colony. The response was the same everywhere as humans began preparing for war. They did not have the advanced technology of the aliens. But they had something better, and that was the human spirit that never knew when to quit fighting. Richard Kane had been waiting for this day his whole life. He stood in the hidden command center deep under the mountains of Colorado and watched as screens all over the world came alive with secret human military projects. For 50 years, humanity had been preparing for a war they hoped would never come, but now that war was here, and it was time to show the galaxy what humans could really do. The first facility to come online was the shipyard hidden in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Amy Rodriguez was already there, waiting for her orders as the massive doors opened to reveal rows of warships that looked nothing like the exploration vessels other aliens used. These ships were built for one purpose, and that purpose was to destroy anything that threatened humanity. Amy walked through the docking bay and looked at her new command. The ship was called the Vengeance, and it was a monster made of steel and weapons. Where alien ships were smooth and pretty, the human ships were covered in armor and gun turrets that could turn entire moons into dust. Amy had trained her whole life to captain a ship like this, and now she would finally get her chance. Steve Wright was on Mars showing his soldiers the new equipment they would use in the coming war. The powered armor made each human soldier as strong as a small tank, and the weapons they carried could punch holes through solid rock. Steve had fought in the colony wars, and he knew that when humans went to war, they did not play games. The soldiers were excited as they tested their new gear. The armor was heavy, but it moved like it was part of their body, and the heads-up display showed them everything they needed to know about the battlefield. The pulse rifles felt good in their hands, and when they fired them at the practice targets, the results were devastating. Mary Foster was working around the clock to coordinate the massive production effort. Every human factory and mining operation had been converted to make weapons and ammunition for the coming war. The asteroid belt was now producing more explosives in a single day than had been made in the entire history of human warfare. The manufacturing ships were working so fast that they were running out of raw materials. Mary had to organize mining expeditions to distant asteroids and even some of the outer moons to keep up with demand. Every human world was now focused on one goal, and that was making sure their military had everything it needed to fight the Devourers. Frank Carter was reviewing the war plans when the first ships began reporting ready for action. The human fleet was not large compared to what the aliens had been using, but every ship was loaded with enough firepower to level countenance. Frank knew that aliens fought wars with precision and skill, but humans fought wars with overwhelming force and determination. The Nova torpedoes were the most powerful weapons humanity had ever created. Each one carried enough explosive power to crack a small moon, and they could be fired from long range. The kinetic bombardment systems were even simpler, but just as deadly as they fired solid chunks of metal at incredible speeds. Helen Torres received reports from all over human space as the military buildup continued. The colonies that had been complaining about defense spending were now grateful that humanity had been preparing for war. Even the peace activists were volunteering to help load ammunition because they understood that this was a fight for the survival of all life in the galaxy. The space elevators on Earth were working day and night to move supplies and personnel into orbit. Civilian ships were being converted into troop transports and supply vessels. Every human who could hold a weapon was being trained to fight, and those who could not fight were working in the factories to support those who could. Jake Morrison was still on Luna Base 7, but now he was coordinating communications between Earth and the fleet. The aliens kept sending more messages asking for help, and each one made it clear that time was running out. The Council forces were being pushed back system by system, and soon they would have nowhere left to run. Susan Blake was working with teams of linguists to establish communication protocols with the surviving alien races. The humans would need to coordinate with the Council forces if they wanted to have any chance of success. She was learning that The aliens had very different ideas about warfare than humans did. The alien races preferred to fight defensive battles using energy shields and precise beam weapons. They had been trying to outlast the Devourers and hoped that the ancient enemy would eventually go back to sleep. The aliens were shocked when they learned that humans planned to hunt down and destroy every single Devourer in the galaxy. Richard Kane was briefing the military commanders on the human approach to warfare. Where aliens used complex strategies and advanced technology, humans relied on simple tactics and overwhelming firepower. The plan was to hit the Devourers so hard and so fast that they would not have time to adapt to human weapons. The human military doctrine was based on lessons learned from thousands of years of warfare on Earth. Humans had learned that the best defense was a good offense and that the way to win a war was to destroy the enemy completely. There would be no negotiation with the Devourers and no mercy for creatures that ate entire worlds. Amy Rodriguez received her final orders as the fleet prepared to depart for the Kepler system. The human ships would jump directly into battle and engage the Devourers with everything they had. There would be no retreat and no surrender, because humanity understood that this was a fight to the death. The final preparations were completed as human ships across the solar system reported ready for jump. The largest military force in human history was about to answer the galaxy's call for help. The aliens had asked for assistance, and humanity was about to show them what human assistance looked like when it came with guns blazing and no intention of backing down from a fight. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system, and Frank Carter immediately knew they had arrived at hell. The space around them was filled with the wreckage of alien ships that had once been the pride of civilizations. Thousands of years old. Pieces of metal and debris floated everywhere, like a graveyard of broken dreams and shattered hopes. Frank stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the tactical display show the full scope of the disaster. The Galactic Council had brought over 10,000 ships to make their last stand at Kepler, but now less than 500 were still fighting. The rest had been torn apart by an enemy that seemed to absorb energy weapons and grow stronger from every attack. The Devourers were unlike anything in human databases or nightmares. They looked like living shadows, the size of cities with tentacles that could wrap around entire starships. Their hulls seemed to be made of some kind of dark matter that bent light around it, and their weapons fired beams of pure destruction that could cut through any known armor. Daniel Clark was leading the first human squadron into the battle zone when he saw his first Devourer up close. The creature was feeding on the wreckage of a Council dreadnought, and it was actually growing larger as it consumed the alien technology. Daniel had fought pirates and rebels in the outer colonies, but nothing had prepared him for fighting something that 8 spaceships, the surviving Council ships, were trying to maintain a defensive formation around their last command vessel, but they were clearly losing the battle. Their energy shields flickered weakly against Devourer attacks, and their beam weapons seemed to do no damage at all. The aliens had been fighting this battle for days, and they were almost at the end of their strength. Beth Turner was monitoring alien communications when she heard the Council Admiral sending what sounded like a final message to any ships that might escape. The alien was thanking his fleet for their service and telling them that they had fought with honor even though they had failed to stop the enemy. Beth felt sick as she realized the aliens thought they were all going to die. Frank opened a communication channel to all human ships and gave the order that would change the course of galactic history. He told his captains to engage the Devourers with everything they had and to show these creatures what happened when they threatened human space. The response from the fleet was immediate as hundreds of ships turned toward the enemy. The first Nova torpedo fired by Amy Rodriguez hit a Devourer in what might have been its center mass. The explosion was bright enough to be seen from the other side of the system, and when the light faded, the Devourer was missing a large chunk of its body. For the first time since the war began, one of the ancient creatures had been seriously damaged. The effect on both sides was immediate and dramatic. The Devourers stopped feeding and turned their attention to these new enemies that could actually hurt them. The Council ships stopped retreating and began transmitting messages of amazement and hope. Something had finally happened that the aliens had thought was impossible. Steve, Wright was commanding one of the assault ships when the Devourers began their counterattack. The creatures moved faster than anything their size should have been, able to move, and their weapons were more powerful than anything humans had ever faced. But the human ships were built to take punishment, and they kept fighting even when their armor was being torn apart. The kinetic bombardment systems proved to be devastatingly effective against Devourer hulls. The solid metal projectiles fired at incredible speeds punched through the dark matter armor like bullets through paper. The creatures tried to adapt their defenses, but humans were firing thousands of rounds per minute, and there was no way to stop them all. Mary Foster was coordinating the ammunition supply lines from her command ship when she realized that humans were using more explosives in this single battle than most civilizations used in their entire history. The human approach to warfare was simple and brutal, but it was working. The Devourers were being forced to retreat for the first time anyone could remember. The Council Admiral sent a message to Frank asking what kind of weapons humans were using because they had never seen anything like them before. Frank replied that humans were using the same weapons they had always used, which were big guns and lots of explosives. The aliens seemed confused by this answer, but Frank thought it was perfectly clear. Jake Morrison was monitoring communications. When he heard Devourer signals for the first time, the creatures were not just mindless beasts but intelligent beings that were communicating with each other about how to deal with this new threat. Jake realized that the Devourers were actually afraid of human weapons, and that gave him hope. The battle lasted for 6 hours, and when it was over, the humans had accomplished something that no other race had managed to do. They had forced the Devourers to retreat from a battle they thought they had already won. 3 of the massive creatures had been completely destroyed, and several others were badly damaged. Susan Blake was translating the messages from surviving council ships, and they were all saying the same thing. The aliens wanted to know where humans had come from and how they had developed weapons that could hurt the Devourers. Susan tried to explain that humans had always been good at making things that could destroy other things. The Council Admiral invited Frank to meet with the surviving fleet commanders to discuss strategy for the next phase of the war. Frank agreed, but he made it clear that humans would be leading the offensive operations from now on. The aliens had tried fighting defensively, and it had not worked, so now they would try the human way. Beth Turner compiled the battle reports and sent them back to Earth with a simple message. Humanity had engaged the Devourers and won the first victory in a war that had seemed hopeless. The creatures could be hurt, and they could be killed, which meant that they could be beaten. The galaxy finally had a chance to survive, and that chance came with human guns and human determination to never give up fighting. News of the human victory at Kepler spread through the surviving alien fleets faster than light itself. Tony Edwards was receiving messages from refugee ships all across the galaxy asking for human protection and escort. For the first time since the Devourer War began, alien civilians had hoped that they might actually survive to see their homeworlds again. The psychological impact of the victory was even more important than the military success. Nancy Howard was studying the communications between alien ships, and she could hear the change in their voices. Before the battle, the aliens had sounded defeated and ready to die, but now they were talking about fighting back and reclaiming their lost territories. The Devourers were also changing their tactics in response to the human threat. They had stopped making direct attacks on heavily defended positions and were now trying to use hit-and-run tactics to avoid human firepower. But this played right into human hands because humans had been hunting dangerous enemies for thousands of years. Kevin Walsh implemented the strategy that would define the rest of the war. Human forces would not wait for the Devourers to attack, but would actively hunt them down across the galaxy. Every human ship would carry enough supplies for extended campaigns, and they would not stop until every last Devourer was destroyed. The liberation of the Antares sector began when Lisa Murphy received reports that a small group of Devourers was feeding on the outer planets. Instead of waiting for them to move on, she took a combined human and alien task force directly into their feeding ground. The aliens were nervous about attacking the creatures in their own territory, but humans had no such concerns. The attack was a perfect example of how human and alien capabilities could work together. The alien ships provided long-range scanning and tactical information, while human ships delivered the devastating firepower needed to destroy the Devourers. The combination proved to be unstoppable as the creatures found themselves surrounded and outgunned. Eric Thompson was analyzing captured Devourer technology when he made a discovery that changed everything. The creatures were not just randomly consuming planets, but were actually collecting stellar energy to power some kind of massive construction project at the edge of the galaxy. The war was not just about survival, but about stopping something even worse from being built. The information about the Devourer project was sent to every human commander, and the response was immediate. Frank Carter issued new orders that turned the hunt for Devourers into a race against time. Human forces had to find and destroy the main Devourer base before whatever they were building could be completed. Roy Spencer was leading a reconnaissance mission into former Devourer territory when his ships discovered something that made his blood run cold. Entire star systems had been drained of energy and left as cold, empty spaces where nothing could ever live again. The scale of destruction was beyond anything humans had imagined possible. The dead systems served as a grim reminder of what would happen to the galaxy if the Devourers were not stopped. Julie Adams transmitted the images back to Earth, where they were broadcast to every human world. The pictures of lifeless planets and extinguished stars strengthened human resolve to continue the fight. No matter what the cost, human manufacturing capabilities were pushed to their absolute limits as the war expanded across multiple sectors. Mary Foster was coordinating supply lines that stretched across thousands of light years while ensuring that every human ship had enough ammunition to fight extended battles. The logistics were nightmarish, but humans made it work through sheer determination. The alien refugees were amazed by human industrial capacity and military organization. They had never seen a race that could produce weapons and supplies so quickly while maintaining such effective coordination across vast distances. Susan Blake explained that humans had learned these skills through thousands of years of warfare on their homeworld. Larry Brooks was commanding a patrol squadron when they encountered their first Devourer breeding ground. The creatures had converted an entire asteroid belt into a nursery where new Devourers were being grown from harvested stellar matter. The sight of baby Devourers the size of buildings made Larry realize that this war was about preventing the galaxy from being turned into food for an expanding swarm. The attack on the breeding ground required every weapon in the human arsenal. Nova torpedoes shattered the larger asteroids, while kinetic bombardment systems destroyed the smaller nursery facilities. The infant Devourers were easier to kill than the adults, but there were thousands of them, and they fought with desperate hunger. Jake Morrison was coordinating intelligence gathering when he learned that the Devourers had been dormant for millions of years before something woke them up. The ancient creatures remembered when the galaxy was young, and they considered all the current civilizations to be temporary infestations that needed to be cleansed from their territory. The revelation that the Devourers saw themselves as the rightful owners of the galaxy made the war personal for every human involved. These creatures were not just trying to feed, but were attempting to reclaim what they thought belonged to them. Frank Carter made it clear that humans had a different opinion about who owned the galaxy. Nancy Howard was studying Devourer psychology when she realized that the creatures were becoming increasingly frustrated by human tactics. They had expected the galaxy to surrender after a show of overwhelming force, but humans refused to accept defeat. The Devourers were learning that humans could be incredibly stubborn when something threatened their survival. The hunt for Devourers expanded into the Outer Rim territories, where the creatures had established major feeding operations. Human forces found systems where the Devourers had been systematically draining stars to power their construction project. The evidence pointed to something massive being built in the darkest regions of space. Amy Rodriguez was leading a strike force against a Devourer supply convoy when her ships intercepted communications that revealed the location of the main enemy base. The creatures called it the Consuming Nexus, and it was hidden in a region of space where matter itself behaved differently. The final battle of the war would be fought in a place where the normal rules of physics did not apply. The news of the Nexus location was transmitted to every human commander along with orders to prepare for the largest military operation in galactic history. Frank Carter was assembling a fleet that would include every available human warship and as many allied vessels as could be spared. The hunt was almost over, and it was time to finish what the Devourers had started. The consuming Nexus was like nothing any human had ever seen or imagined. Frank Carter stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched as the massive structure filled the entire view screen with its impossible geometry. The thing was larger than most solar systems, and it seemed to bend space around itself in ways that made experienced spacers feel sick just looking at it. Eric Thompson had spent weeks studying the intelligence reports about the Nexus, but seeing it in person was completely different. The structure was built from dark matter and stellar energy that had been harvested from thousands of dead star systems. At its center was a pulsing core that seemed to be alive and aware of everything around it. The approach to the Nexus was defended by more Devourers than had ever been seen in one place. Roy Spencer was leading the advanced squadrons when his ships encountered the first defensive line. The creatures had arranged themselves in patterns that created overlapping fields of destructive energy, but humans had dealt with heavy defenses before. The human battle plan was typically direct and brutal. Instead of trying to find weak points in the Devourer defenses, the fleet would simply smash through them with overwhelming firepower. Amy Rodriguez was commanding one of the assault groups, and she could see dozens of other human formations preparing to charge into the enemy lines. Julie Adams was monitoring the tactical displays when she realized that the Devourers were not just defending the Nexus, but were actually drawing power from it to strengthen their attacks. The closer human ships got to the structure, the more dangerous the enemy became. This meant that the final assault would be the most difficult part of the entire war. The first wave of human ships hit the Devourer defensive lines like a hammer, striking glass. Nova torpedoes lit up space with nuclear fire, while kinetic bombardment systems sent streams of metal projectiles into enemy formations. The creatures fought back with weapons that could tear holes in reality itself, but humans kept advancing. Larry Brooks was commanding a heavy assault ship when the Devourers began using their most powerful weapons. Beams of pure destruction that could vaporize entire ships were aimed at the human fleet, but the ships were built to survive heavy damage. Even when their armor was melted away, the human vessels kept fighting until they were nothing but floating wreckage. The cost of the assault was terrible, but humans were willing to pay it. Mary Foster was watching the casualty reports come in, and she knew that thousands of good people were dying to give the galaxy a chance to survive. But this was what humans did when faced with extinction, and they would not stop until the job was finished. Steve Wright was leading Marine assault teams against Devourer constructs that had boarded human ships during the battle. The creatures were trying to consume the vessels from the inside, but they had not counted on meeting human soldiers in close combat. The Marines fought with weapons designed for ship-to-ship fighting, and they were not impressed by enemies that could be killed with enough bullets. The breakthrough came when Tony Edwards discovered that the Nexus was not just a construction project, but was actually a giant communication device. The Devourers were using it to coordinate their actions across the entire galaxy, and if it could be destroyed, then every Devourer everywhere would lose their connection to the collective consciousness. Frank Carter immediately changed the battle plan to focus all human firepower on the Nexus core. The structure was heavily defended and protected by energy shields that could absorb the power of exploding stars, but humans had weapons that worked differently than anything the Devourers had faced before. Nancy Howard was analyzing Devourer communications when she realized that the creatures were becoming desperate. They had never expected any race to reach the Nexus, and they were not prepared for the kind of sustained assault that humans were capable of launching. The ancient enemies were learning that humans did not know how to give up. The final assault required coordination between every human ship in the fleet. Lisa Murphy was directing the attack pattern that would concentrate the firepower of 3,000 vessels on a single point. The amount of energy being focused on the Nexus core was enough to ignite a small star, but the structure was absorbing everything and asking for more. Jake Morrison was coordinating communications between the assault groups when he heard something. That changed everything. The Devourers were not just defending the Nexus, but were actually trying to activate whatever device was hidden inside it. The creatures knew they were losing the battle, and they were attempting to complete their project. Before they could be stopped, Susan Blake was translating Devourer signals when she learned what the device was supposed to do. The Nexus was designed to drain energy from every star in the galaxy simultaneously and use that power to create new Devourers. If the device was activated, then the entire galaxy would die in a matter of hours and the universe would belong to. The ancient creatures, the race against time, intensified as human forces poured everything they had into destroying the Nexus core. Roy Spencer led his squadron in a suicide attack that punched through the final defensive layer, while Amy Rodriguez coordinated missile strikes that began to crack the structure's outer shell. Eric Thompson was monitoring the Nexus energy readings when he detected signs that the device was beginning to activate. The core was drawing power from the surrounding Devourers and converting it into something that could reach across galactic distances. Humanity had only minutes to prevent the destruction of every living thing in the galaxy. The solution came from an unexpected source when Larry Brooks realized that the Nexus required a steady energy input to maintain its activation sequence. If enough Devourers could be destroyed simultaneously, then the power flow would be interrupted, and the device would shut down before it could complete its work. Frank Carter issued the final order of the war as every human weapon was aimed at every Devourer in the area. The concentrated firepower of the entire human fleet was unleashed in a single devastating salvo that lit up space brighter than any star. When the light faded, the ancient enemies were nothing but scattered debris, floating in the void. The silence that followed the destruction of the consuming Nexus was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. Frank Carter stood on his bridge watching as the massive structure collapsed in on itself like a dying star. The ancient device that could have destroyed every living thing in the galaxy was now nothing more than twisted metal and fading energy. Signatures drifting through space. Julie Adams was the first to notice that something had changed across the entire battlefield. The remaining Devourers had stopped moving and their weapons had gone silent. The creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for months were now floating motionless in space like giant corpses. Whatever had connected them to each other and given them purpose was gone. Reports began coming in from across the galaxy, as human commanders confirmed what everyone hoped was true. Every Devourer everywhere had stopped functioning at exactly the same moment. The ancient enemies that had consumed entire civilizations were now just empty shells drifting through the void with no intelligence left to guide them. Larry Brooks had made the ultimate sacrifice to create the opening that allowed the human fleet to destroy the Nexus core. His damaged ship had rammed into a critical support structure, and the explosion had created a chain reaction that brought down the entire facility. His crew had known they were going to die, but they had done it anyway because that was what humans did when everything was at stake. Amy Rodriguez was receiving damage reports from her surviving ships when she realized the full cost of the victory. Over half the human fleet had been destroyed or badly damaged in the final assault. Thousands of good people had died to save a galaxy that most humans had never seen. But they had succeeded in doing something that no other race thought was possible. The alien refugees were the first to break the silence as messages of gratitude and amazement poured in from every corner of the galaxy. Susan Blake was working around the clock to translate the communications from dozens of different species, but they were all saying the same thing. Humanity had accomplished the impossible and saved everyone. Tony Edwards was leading rescue operations to recover survivors from the battle zone when his ships detected something unexpected. The destruction of the Nexus had created a massive energy wave that was spreading across the galaxy at faster than light speed. Wherever the wave passed, the dead Devourers were dissolving into harmless particles that would eventually become stardust. Nancy Howard was analyzing the psychological impact of the victory on both humans and aliens. the other races had spent so long believing that the Devourers were unstoppable that they were having trouble accepting that the threat was really over. Humans, on the other hand, were already making plans to hunt down any remaining Devourer technology and make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. Eric Thompson was studying the remains of Nexus when he made a discovery that explained why the Devourers had been so dangerous. The creatures were not native to this galaxy but had come from somewhere else in the universe. They had been using the Nexus to send signals back to their home dimension, and if they had succeeded, then more Devourers would have invaded. The implications of this discovery were staggering because it meant that the threat to the galaxy might not be completely over. Frank Carter ordered scientific teams to analyze every piece of Devourer technology they could find to make sure that no communication had gotten through to wherever the creatures had come from. Jake Morrison was coordinating the effort to re-establish contact with isolated human colonies when he received a message that changed everything. The Galactic Council was requesting a meeting with human leadership to discuss the future of the galaxy. The aliens wanted to offer humanity a permanent seat on the Council and recognition as the primary military force in the galaxy. Helen Torres received the invitation while she was reviewing casualty reports from the war. The cost had been terrible, but humanity had proven something important about themselves. When faced with extinction, they had not run away or surrendered, but had fought back with everything they had. The galaxy had learned that humans were not just another peaceful species, but were warriors who would fight to protect the innocent. The council meeting was held in the ruins of the Kepler system, where humanity had first proven that the Devourers could be defeated. Representatives from every surviving alien civilization gathered to witness humanity being officially recognized as the guardians of galactic peace. Frank Carter accepted the position on behalf of all humans, but with conditions. Humanity would serve as the galaxy's military protectors, but they would do it their way. There would be no more defensive strategies or hoping that threats would go away on their own. Human forces would actively hunt down any danger to peaceful civilizations and destroy it before it could grow strong enough to threaten innocent lives. Roy Spencer was promoted to admiral and given command of the new Galactic Defense Force. His job would be to establish human military bases throughout the galaxy and train alien forces in human combat tactics. The universe was a dangerous place, but it would be safer now that humanity was watching over it. Mary Foster was put in charge of industrial coordination between human and alien manufacturing capabilities. The war had shown that human production methods were far more efficient than anything the aliens had developed. Working together, they could build a military force that would be able to handle any threat that might emerge. Steve Wright became the head of the new Galactic Marine Corps that would be responsible for ground combat operations. His soldiers would train with alien allies and share human infantry tactics that had proven so effective against the Devourers. Any enemy that thought they could terrorize peaceful worlds would have to deal with human Marines first. The war was over, but humanity's role as the protectors of the galaxy was just beginning. Lisa Murphy was already planning patrol routes that would cover every inhabited system and ensure that no threat could grow large enough to endanger civilian populations. The galaxy had cried for help and humanity had answered with firepower. But they had also answered with something more important. Humans had shown the galaxy what it meant to never give up fighting for what was right. They had proven that sometimes the best way to protect peace was to be better at war than anyone else. The universe would always be dangerous, but as long as humanity was watching the stars, peaceful civilizations could sleep safely knowing that if anything threatened them, humans would come running with guns blazing and no intention of backing down from a fight.